One of the moments, or one of the unique things about this moment is how it's making a lot of people reevaluate the current system in healthcare. Obviously, Medicare for All is the issue people most associate you with. Could you just speak to how this moment would be different if we had a system like Medicare for All and the shortcomings of the current system we're living with?
Well, thank you for asking that question, Seth. And I think the answer is fairly obvious. Right now, as we speak, millions of people are losing their jobs, and some 87 million people already did not have any health insurance or are underinsured. So people are sitting home right now, scared to death that somebody in their family is going to come down with the virus. They don't know how they will even pay for the treatment that they receive, let alone any other healthcare problems their families have. Second of all, people are asking, how does it happen when we spend twice as much per person on healthcare as any other nation, and yet our public health system is so weak, so incredibly weak, that we have doctors and nurses right now who don't have the masks, don't have the gloves, don't have the gowns, the protective equipment they need to keep themselves safe and do the work that they have to do. A Medicare for All system is designed to provide quality care for all, to do preventative work in order to prepare for some types of pandemics, not simply to make huge amounts of money for the insurance companies and the drug companies.
This, again, moment in time led to a bipartisan bill being passed, a bill that the president signed. You still used your time on the Senate floor to be a bit sarcastic towards your Republican colleagues. We do enjoy your sarcasm. We feel like it's when your Brooklyn comes out. You were referring to the fact that some across the aisle felt that the bill was being too generous to the less fortunate, to...
Sanders is still making the argument for Medicare for all, even now. Yes, he's been somewhat marginalized in the political space because he's dropped out the race. Yes, he's dedicated all of his attention to getting Joe Biden elected. That's true. But when he talks about this, he's still advocating for this particular policy. And you can understand why. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and being in the middle of a pandemic, you had 26 million people to lose their jobs. 43% of the population either lost their job or lost wages. 10 million people without health care at this point. And again, that doesn't even touch the number of people who didn't have health care before. What is that, 89 or 80 million people either with underinsured or no health care at all? And all of that adds stress onto a situation that was already stressed. I mean, think about it for the moment. You had people who, the majority of the population, was persistently vulnerable, living from paycheck to paycheck, not even having $500 in the bank for an emergency. 50% of the population in like a low-wage job. And so you add to that the coronavirus, with all of these people losing wages, all of these people losing their ability to pay for various things, all of these people either getting furloughed. You've added that much more stress to a situation that was already stressed. And the best that the government can do is $1,200. Look, if you had, at the very least, a Medicare for All system, the testing, there's no disincentive for people to actually go and get checked out. It gives you more flexibility in your ability to deal with this particular illness, not to mention have a somewhat of a point of contact in the federal government running events in regards to dealing with the medical emergency aspect of it. Sanders is still making this case. For the last, 7 months, every centrist Democrat lined up in order to take shots at Medicare for All. And despite all of them lining up to take shots at Medicare for All, the reality of it is the popularity of Medicare for All, it was demonstrated in the fact that each and every one of them was called in their plans Medicare for All, Medicare for Choice, Medicare for people who want it, Medicare for people with bad backs. It was always some variation of Medicare for something, getting across that this was something that was lacking in compared to the actual Medicare for All, because if it was Medicare for All, they would just call it that. Meaning the very fact that you're trying to con people into thinking that what you are pushing is some way akin to Medicare for All because you've named it or put Medicare in the title of it, people still, to some degree, understood that that plan, whatever they were pushing, was inferior to the actual Medicare for All plan, that the Medicare for All plan was going to be the gold standard and anything else was lesser than. People got it. They got it just from the way they were pushing their own healthcare plans. My point is just straightforward in regards to we're in the middle of a pandemic. And in the middle of a pandemic, our healthcare is still tethered to our jobs. And so the moment that these jobs were lost, the healthcare went right along with it. Instead of doing these things that's in the best interest of human health and human development, we boil all of this stuff down to issues of profit, meaning dealing with insurance companies, dealing with doctors, dealing with hospitals. All of this additional money that is in our system or that sloshes around in our system that we're putting out of our pockets to get what other countries around the world get for what, half the price that we pay in this country. Last time around in 2016, this was the split. North Carolina, Clinton 4.5 results, Trump 3.6. Pennsylvania, Clinton 5.3, Trump's 0.7. Florida, Clinton 7.0 results, Trump 1.2. Wisconsin, Clinton 13 points, Trump 0.7. What do you notice? They had Clinton winning all of those swing states. What ended up happening? She won none of them. If Al Gore lost and John Kerry lost and Hillary Clinton lost, why do you believe that Joe Biden is going to be somehow fundamentally different than that? Those voters who backed Clinton will most likely back Biden. But will those people who back Trump deviate from Trump, especially with the level of popularity that Trump has in the Republican Party? I'm skeptical of that. Lefties have been doing politics wrong. Now, a poll was taken, Hill Harris, on Medicare for All. 69% support Medicare for all. Let me repeat that. 69% of the population supports Medicare for all. Nothing else is close. Meaning, from a policy standpoint, you've won the argument. Your basic question is, how do you get material implementation of what you've already won conceptually? That's the question. And I would make the point that you can get those concessions, you can get that policy that you want, but you can't do it from a cowardly perspective. All of us have to line up in solidarity on that particular plan, especially since that plan is that monstrously popular. 69% is astonishingly high. And keep in mind, 2008, it was not even on the table. It was not even believed that the policy would pass, or would get popularity, let alone pass, or let alone get this high of approval. They lined up against Medicare for all for the past year. And after all of it was said and done, despite Joe Biden winning, it still ends up with 69% approval. And also keep in mind, even in states that Sanders lost by like 30 points, like South Carolina, Medicare for all still came out as the #1 healthcare policy that people chose. The tip of your spear is this. And honestly, we need to do something different than we have been doing over the last 50 years, especially if your objective is to get policy accomplished and not just stop somebody from getting in office. There are times where principle matters more, especially if you're looking at elections in the context of time and you've effectively allowed a race to the bottom by no longer have accountability in the political process. So this particular person now can run because no standards has been established and set that the party, that people, that lefties will not accept X or not accept Y. Meaning the next time around, they would already know in advance that if they run that person, they're going to lose. Without having standards, without having accountability, that process never takes place. And so the bar always continues to move further and further and further to the right as you go out more and more elections, with the left continuously not putting any leverage or exerting any leverage in the political process, and the left not having standards or accountability. I want to talk about the Medicare for all being 69%. And I want to talk about what the left needs to do at this very moment. Right now, starting right now, even if we don't necessarily have the ability to talk, bitch, moan, and work in tandem together. At the very least, we can all function as a single entity in regards to our objective in getting this particular policy over the finish line. You don't need to have power in order to exert influence. You don't need to occupy a square in order to exert influence on that square. Same thing. 69%. If you can't get this through now, you never will. Welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Jamal Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, subscribe. You can always support PayPal, Patreon. I'm not going to keep this video long, but I do kind of want to make just a very basic point. Clinton lost that last election. Sanders stumped for, he tried to get his people to vote for, but at the end of the day, you saw those superdelegates, or those states, basically flip. Regardless of what the polling is showing right now, during that time frame, the polling was showing Clinton also winning. Meaning you can't take for granted that you're going to get over the finish line, especially when you have recent history showing that whatever the polling is showing, it could be wrong, especially when you get to the point of election day. Lefties have been doing politics wrong. They need to realize that. Over the last 50 years, you have effectively folded yourself into the Democratic Party, regardless of what the Democratic Party did, regardless of what they supported, regardless of where they were on the political space, regardless of them moving further and further to the right, regardless of your policy priorities never being addressed or attended to, regardless of you being taken advantage of. We want your vote, but we don't necessarily want your opinion. They remain politically equivalent to battered wives, and they stay in the party. But consider your world now. You know that Medicare for All is popular. You know that Medicare for All is at 69%. And despite having no longer a leader in the political space, the fact that you know this policy is popular to this degree, to this tune, a decent argument can be made that if Joe Biden wants to get elected, and if you, as Bernie Sanders, wants to get Joe Biden elected, then the way to do it, believe it or not, it may be even counterintuitive, is to not give your unilateral support. This kind of goes to my point of saying lefties have been doing politics wrong. You want policy accomplished. Great. And wanting to get policy accomplished, it doesn't hurt Joe Biden for you to stand on this notion of you accept this. This is no longer a race to the bottom. This is indeed a litmus test. You get 69% approval rating for it. So yeah, we're going to stand on principle, and you want our vote? This is the concession. Now, Joe Biden can accept it or not. If he doesn't accept it and he loses, then you've gained that much more leverage in the political space as people start to realize, and it dawns on them, that unless we're willing to support Medicare for all, we're not going to get the support of the left. Meaning you set a standard by which people don't go below because they know at that point they can't necessarily win. I hope you understand how dramatically important that is. Losing an election is not as important sometimes as ensuring that the standards are not entirely blown away and that no political accountability is in the process. The truth of the matter is, if the left actually held Joe Biden accountable, if the left actually refused to back Joe Biden if he wasn't necessarily willing to give those concessions, they would have a much better chance at actually getting Joe Biden elected. The reason is because basically you are trying to generate a huge amount of support in order to bring the left together. Where Joe Biden only has 24% enthusiasm. Basically, the moderate who says nothing is going to fundamentally change doesn't necessarily get anybody revved up in the political process. You need kids, you need younger demographic, you need those people out there stomping for you, knocking on doors for you. You need to get those people engaged. And the way that you get those people engaged is giving something to those people regarding a political concession. Medicare for All is dramatically popular. The fact that Medicare for All is dramatically popular, even more so in the context of the Democratic Party, but overall dramatically popular. There is no excuse to not run with a policy that is this popular. And from the standpoint of the left, if you want to peel off support from people who are never Biden, from people who would never vote the Democratic Party, for people who might even went over to vote for Trump, if you want to organically peel off those people from that particular position, the way to do it is to tie Joe Biden to the Medicare for All and force him through this notion of you get our support when you give us this particular concession. then you have a much better chance of actually getting the guy over the finish line as compared to what you did in 2016, where you basically just try to push your supporters to vote for somebody without getting any real political concessions. On the second point, it is unacceptable to win the policy argument to this degree and turn around and not fight for that policy. By not fighting for that policy, what I mean by that is being willing to walk, to say you either accept this or you lose. And to the tune of millions, stand on that with a certain degree of solidarity and make that point that much clearer. Meaning, you accept this policy that is dramatically popular, that most of the population wants, that will give you a certain share of the Bernie vote that you might not have otherwise gotten. It's in your best interest to accept this policy. But beyond it being in your best interest, you will lose if you don't accept it. And having millions of people standing beside you, attesting and saying the exact same thing. That is your pathway to getting that policy accomplished. That is your leverage in the political process. When they tell you you have nowhere else to go, that is the way of cowing you, so you don't ask questions about what the person is going to do in that office and you focus entirely on the fact that you are trying to keep a Republican out. I am making the point that doing that removes all standards of accountability from the political process and basically allows a race to the bottom. Lefties, if you ever want to get anything accomplished, you not only neuter your ability to get your policy objectives accomplished, but by allowing this level of incrementalism and by allowing these people who don't necessarily deal with the amelioration of the working class or dealing with the vagaries of poverty within the context of our country, you subvert your own vote. Like, the demographic that doesn't necessarily vote tends to be poorer and tends to be people of color, the very demographic that's part of the Democratic Party. By not dealing with the material concerns of those people, you suppress the vote. So not only is the left neutering anything that it wants to get done in this notion of less harm by voting for the random Democrat, but it also makes its potential for winning that much worse by basically allowing Democrats to be incrementalists as opposed to holding their feet to the fire and making them accountable to the various policies that you believe need to be implemented. You know this is popular at this point. This should be the tip of your spear, and you should be willing to use that tip of the spear in the context of saying you will not get our support unless you get those concessions. Why on earth would you give your support over without concessions? We've done it for the last 50 years. How that worked out for you. Imagine for the moment somebody arguing they would vote for a party that pushes one concentration camp less, missing the fact that over 4 years or 8 years or 12 years, that these elections can't be looked at in the narrow context of a singular election. The only way to make sense of elections is looked at over the course of time. And while you might be building one concentration camp less now, well, that's the issue of relative distance, right? You can build 20 additional concentration camps, both parties, and still end up with a relative distance of 1. Hell, you can have a relative distance of 10. This party is building 10 concentration camps less, but now over the course of the last 20, 30, 40 years, you've upped the level to 50 concentration camps that the group is building, despite the fact that they're 10 less. I'm making the point that if your politics has allowed you to drift further and further and further to the right because you remove all level of accountability and you narrow the focus of elections into specific events without taking into the context of time where, based on removing accountability, you've essentially allowed the party to go further and further and further to the right. At some point, that process needs to stop. And your pathway to getting the policy that you want is to stand in solidarity on this one specific issue. People like Nita Turner, people like Brianna Joy Gray, AOC, Jayapal, all of these people should be willing to stand by all of these youth groups and give those youth groups credibility and bolstering those youth groups and saying, we are not going to support you unless you toe this policy agenda. This policy agenda is popular. The people even want Bernie Sanders for vice president. Toe the agenda or lose. All of those people need to be willing to do that. And if they did that, that will create this kind of wave, maybe even a sea change in regards to having lefties finally grow a backbone and finally be able to make these kind of policy demands with the actual force of being willing to let the party lose if they don't toe those demands. You must realize the party did the exact same thing to you in this election. The Democratic Party was perfectly okay for Donald Trump to win if it means stopping Sanders. When all of them were in the debate stage, the issue of the broker convention came up, and every last Democrat basically said, I would rip this away from Sanders in a brokered convention if I got the opportunity. Which means that all of them knew that they would lose that race if you tried to do something like that, because the people who would vote for you under this circumstance wouldn't necessarily vote for you under that one. You would lose. They know they would lose, but that mattered less than stopping Sanders. It's possible that the Democratic Party cares less about policy concessions as opposed to losing to Trump. Meaning the precedent that may be set from the Democratic Party having policy concessions with the left might be too much for them to deal with. It may be better off for them to lose to Trump in their mind as opposed to setting that precedent where the left is able to negotiate for better policies. Setting that particular precedent, the left realizes that it does have power, agency in the process, and does have leverage if it is willing to essentially stand in solidarity for a particular principle. It is important that the left doesn't understand that. So it's possible that they wouldn't be willing to accept the policy concessions, even if that means losing to Trump. The question that the Democratic Party needs to answer is that basically, the question that the Democratic Party basically needs to answer, if you are in a process where you have a policy that is popular, why, if Trump is indeed throwing toddlers in concentration camps, if Trump is indeed destroying the environment, one onerous policy after the next, if you are right that he is kicking babies and eating puppies, then why are you willing to risk losing to Trump, that person who's kicking babies and eating puppies and putting toddlers in concentration camps, in lieu of supporting a policy or two from the left that the left requires, but to basically come together in a certain alignment? Meaning, it seems that they're more interested in potentially losing to Trump than in giving the policy concessions. And I suspect a lot of that has to do with not wanting to allow the left to realize that it has agency and power in the process. It just doesn't necessarily assert it. AOC, Jayapal, Nina Turner, many of these guys need to be able to stand in solidarity on this point. And again, be willing to say, you're not going to get our support. This would immediately embolden and strengthen many of the lefties to come to that position also. And the more people you get to that particular position, the better off of an opportunity that you will get to get what you want policy-wise. You have not gotten it over the last 50 years because you gave your support away for free. Yes, they were going to take advantage of you if you allowed them to do such. That's just politics. If you're giving over your support 90% to Democrats, or if you're giving over the large share of your support, you're already in the bag. So they're not necessarily going to spend a huge amount of time giving stuff to people who are already in the bag. They're going to go for people who are not necessarily there. Your pathway through this is to stand on principle. That's the only way through. There is no magical door. You have to, at some point, stop the notion of a race to the bottom and start setting standards in regards to what you're willing and not willing to accept. And even though the Democratic Party may lose an election, you shouldn't necessarily consider yourself part of the party. You should consider yourself as an advocate for various policies. Being an advocate for policies allows Republicans, independents, pretty much anybody, to join you in being an advocate for that policy, and has a big tent without having the notion of a party separating people up in this kind of divisive way. That's my agenda from this point on. This notion that these are the policies I'm willing to support or not. Meaning if you're, not going to back my policies, you're not going to get my support. And if millions of people stood there with me, you will, for once in your life, actually get what you want politically. And you will, for once in your life, stop being maligned in a political space. That is your pathway to getting something real accomplished. Like, share, subscribe. 80s Siva DBO. Thanks for all you do. Don't know what I would do without you in the real journalism on YouTube. I don't think I'm a journalist. I think I'm an opinionist more than anything else. I mean, I do try to give stories and everything else that's going on, but I try to give my opinion in the context of those stories. But thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate it. like, share, subscribe.